4646 MLO, going ahead in 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
This is one of the highest points of the Burton Dasset Hills just outside Banbury in Oxfordshire. We've been here since 8 o'clock last night. It's now just after 4:15. We're here to observe unidentified flying objects. During the last few weeks, no less than 275 UFO sightings have been reported around Banbury, so tonight's Skywatch, as it's called. It's been organised by the International UFO Association, and they've done it to prepare a report for the Ministry of Defence. It's not the association's fault that there's been 10 tenths cloud and it's been raining all night. There are people who think that our planet has been under observation by beings not only from other planets, but from other galaxies for the last 10,000 years. There's no particular reason why they should have landed in Banbury tonight, and so far they haven't. Not that the serious sky watchers have been put off.
Right, if we can all now go up to the top of the beacon, and we can have a good look up, good sky watch from up there. If you guys follow me up there, please.
Okay.
Whatever newspapers, magazines, radio or television might say is like water off a duck back to serious ufologists. Neither rain, odd hours nor personal inconvenience can put them off. Banbury is only the latest place to have a sighting epidemic. The saucer spotters at the Skywatch remembered the famous Warminster sightings of the late 50s and George Adamski's notorious encounter with the Venusians. He claimed he was taken round Venus in a spacecraft, and deep down inside these people hope perhaps to know less.
I wonder if this is going to be another Warminster though. Another 4-year plan.
I just couldn't tell.
It would be nice if it was though.
Just don't know.
Because, you know, we could come here and no need to go to Warminster, as it were.
Warminster's probably, yeah, Warminster sort of died out a bit. There's been about 4 reports there in the last month or 2.
275 sightings within 9 weeks is pretty good here.
Every spate of new sightings inevitably provokes a flood of new theories from ufologists. The Banbury sightings are no exception, although Skywatch organiser, Keith Palmer, accepts that some people may find his present ideas difficult to take.
I believe they're coming from another star system. And when we're talking about them, we're talking about several different types of entities. This we must get right. We're not talking about just one lot of visitors. We're talking about several different types. And I think that they are star travellers. I don't think they were from within our solar system. I should imagine that some of them have been coming for thousands of years and they're just watching us progress. And some people even believe that these people that are visiting us now actually puts us here in the first place. And they're coming back to make sure that we don't blow ourselves up, because we are their humanoids. We might laugh on this, but it could be a fact.
But Bernard Byron is sure about who they are.
They are from the second planet from the star Kruger, which is inhabited by 2 races. One race is a people that's very similar to ourselves, except the mouth and the eyes are bigger and the mouth is bigger, and also the neck is longer. A terrific long neck, and they have a grey-blue skin, and I think the colour of their skin is according to their planet, which is a grey-blue.
Now, do you, in fact, understand the Kruger language, or do they communicate with you in English?
Well, it's very difficult to say something in Kruger because it takes the what should I say, the wind from your lungs, and I haven't done it for quite a time. I can get round one much easier, like the Kruger language in the 50s. I was a much stronger man then with the lungs. Yeah. And you know, as I've got over 50, I don't do so much of it. But the Pluto people, and there's lots of people who believe that there's no one on that planet. There's not many in our solar system on our planets, but there is on Pluto, the furthest planet. Now, the Pluto language is what does that mean? That means you are here tonight, we would be wasting our time. I don't mean to say, I'm just putting this into things. We would be wasting our time with all the rain. Or we are wasting our time with all the rain.
What was his name? Bev Harrow. He's seen the latest sightings.
Despite the downpour, ufologists and researchers continue to catalogue sightings, confident that a comprehensive study of the facts will, one day, justify their theories. But how does this interest start?
Really through history, through the evidence that we can see on Earth of extraterrestrial visits deep in the past which archaeology can look at.
What evidence is there a visit?
I think quite conclusive evidence to show perhaps that people on Earth have been influenced by extraterrestrial technology are things like the battery in the Baghdad Museum, a workable small battery dating from 4000 BC, ground lenses found in Assyria, ground with a method we only thought we invented a couple of 100 years ago.
Do you think any effort is being made to establish contact with human beings?
I don't know whether the effort is intentional or whether, if you're not, that what you might call contact that has been made has been the result of accident and so forth. It's very hard to say. In George Adamski's case, a famous case in the 50s, who was thought in turn a pathological liar, a fake, or simply somebody in it for the money, who claimed to have met a Venusian, has since been looked at rather closely because the Venusian he's claimed to have met took from him a negative from his camera and then took it away again and returned a couple of weeks later, so the story goes. The flying saucer zoomed in over Palomar Gardens, where Adamski lived, and dropped a plastic package in which was this incredible negative, and Adamski took it out, and on it were hieroglyphics. They looked like coded notions of a power plan. Everybody said, it's a fake, it's a fake. Adamski dies. 2-3 years later, the archaeologist, French archaeologist Marcel Homé in Brazil discovers a 20,000-year-old petroglyph, a carving on stone buried in the remains of a ruined city. Exactly the same coded markings. Exactly identical. I mean, what one can say, I just don't know. One has to, let's say, relook at Adamski anyway. He died before anyone knew about this.
But eventually the downpour drove even the most ardent sky watchers to call it a night. Even though the professionals saw nothing, in the market town of Banbury itself there are people who are quite convinced they have seen objects in broad daylight, both flying and unidentified. They're convinced that these UFOs can't be identified.
Well, actually, it was about 2 or 3 days after that programme on the television, ATV Today was it? They showed those flying across a field. Well, the ones I saw, I'm sure, were exactly the same as those.
What did
it was
they do?
About, well, they just went across, 3 of them went across the sky. But I couldn't, I mean, they weren't that close, I couldn't tell you what they were like. It was just the, what shall I say, not the flash, what was the...
Vapour trail?
No, there wasn't exactly a vapour trail, it was like a flame, not exactly a flame. See, I can't find the right word that I want to explain
like out of the
it.
back of a jet engine?
That sort of thing, yes, and it was constant, and there were 3 of them. And they just sort of moved across the sky, and I went down to the village to fetch my mum to have a look at them.
It's all in your mind, Shirley, isn't it?
It isn't,
Yes,
it isn't.
It's all in your mind.
It's not all in my
Of course
mind.
it is. You're talking a load of rubbish, ain't you?
Fiddlesticks to you. If you'd seen them, you'd know.
I know, I have seen them, and they crawl about, don't
No,
they?
they
But I mean,
don't.
it depends where you've been for the 2 hours before, don't it?
Honestly. Now, before I was so rudely interrupted, where was I? Oh yes, and then I went and fetched my mother from the village. They'd gone out of sight except one, and it was hovering in the distance. It was just hovering.
This house, a vicarage, was the scene of perhaps the most fascinating and inexplicable sighting in Banbury. The Reverend Raymond Hayne and his family were having tea one evening when they all saw a mysterious object. The children saw it first, and for a moment neither Raymond Hayne nor his wife Catherine could believe what Claire, aged 9, said she saw.
Well, it was a sort of round, white-shaped object, and it was over there, and it suddenly came over here, gradually changing from pink to red, and then disappeared into the clouds.
Does anybody else see it?
Yeah.
Yes, we all saw
We
it.
all saw it.
We went outside to have a look if it was a real UFO. And first Claire said, that looks like a UFO. And then Daddy had a look. So then we squabbled about if it was a UFO and it wasn't. And if it wasn't a UFO.
Now, who thought it was and who thought it wasn't?
Well, I thought it was because it didn't have an airplane noise, and it was going quite fast along like that.
And who thought it wasn't?
Mummy thought it wasn't.
I said nonsense at first, but then when I looked, there was no explanation for it. It wasn't an aeroplane.
Because we couldn't hear the noise.
There was surrounding the light, there was some solid matter, but there was certainly no sign of wings or tail or anything like an aeroplane or
Did it have a
helicopter.
constant? Did it have a constant motion or an intermittent motion?
No, it was travelling very fast, and then you thought it stopped, but I got up to go round to the front to see it better. You thought it stopped, didn't you?
We have a slight disagreement about this particular point. I felt that it hesitated, or at least slowed down very considerably. The speed was certainly erratic. It came over very slowly, almost directly over the garden and the vicarage, and hesitated for, well, it may have been anything up to a minute, because we were out there for very nearly a minute, weren't we, altogether. And then it certainly increased its speed and went off at a very high speed indeed, and it got higher all the time.
UFO sightings haven't been confined to Banbury or to this century, and in this bookshop just off the Charing Cross Road, they specialise, among other things, in books on the Orient, the occult, and flying saucers. UFO sightings certainly aren't a new phenomenon. There are people who believe that there are quite specific references to flying saucers and UFOs in the Bible. For instance, a verse in Ezekiel which says, "And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it." And a bit later on in the Bible, in Exodus, "The angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire." And nobody's ever really managed to explain rationally what this flame of fire could be. According to the ancients, UFOs were nothing at all to do with visitors from outer space. They were entirely to do with religion. And where these strange manifestations occurred, they quite often founded churches. In his book, The Flying Saucer Vision, John Michel points out that flying saucers were observed by the most ancient and most primitive people. For instance, at Kimberley in Western Australia, the Aborigines have this painting, which was supposed to have been done by the gods themselves, who came down to the earth, did the painting, and now travel about among the stars in vehicles of very bright light. And then in the Sahara, there's this cave painting which has figures and other objects on, and I suppose this could easily be a flying saucer. And also in the Sahara there's another wall painting of an old god, which the people who found it described as the Great Martian. Well, if you're not convinced, there are two 16th century prints, in fact from Basel and Nuremberg, which show the most extraordinary phenomenon that were sighted over those towns in 1561 and 1566. The modern ufologist, of course, has a great technical advance to use. He can use the camera. He can take photographs of these objects, and of course the camera doesn't lie, does it? On May the 7th, in 1952, these pictures were taken in Rio de Janeiro. Here the object looks demonstrably like a disc, but here it looks suspiciously like an approaching aircraft. And what about this? An intergalactic armada about to invade? Well, it could be, but it's actually what's called a lenticular cloud. These lights were seen off Massachusetts, and they were photographed by a coast guard. And in Sweden, a very similar phenomenon was actually filmed, and this is believed to be the only authenticated film there is of a completely unidentifiable flying object. And this is one of the famous Warminster sightings of a few years ago. But just to show how easy it is to hoax this sort of picture, this is a matchbox hanging from a tree. So is this the real thing? Well, these were found in 1967 at 30-mile intervals in a straight line all across southern England, and they were giving off an odd bleeping noise. The police blew them up and found they were made of glass fibre filled with foul-smelling gas and a small electric bleeping device. Students later admitted that these were a hoax, and this really is the great problem facing the serious ufologist. It really is just too easy to manufacture hoaxes. Gordon Crichton, you're a director of the magazine Flying Saucer Review. If the evidence doesn't lie in photographs, where does it lie?
I think the evidence lies in the steady drip, drip, drip on the stone, the accumulation over the years, the thousands and thousands and thousands of press clippings that come into us, letters from all over the world, in all languages. If I had time off from my work now, I'm a busy man, if I could, I've got a stack that deep just of South American material the last few years, all flying saucer reports, which haven't been processed.
From the vast amount of information you've received, what do you think flying saucers are?
Well, it's a wonderful word, flying saucer, and of course the gag boys have had a lot of fun with it at our expense.
Well, let's call it unidentified flying object.
Yes, but I'd like to say that even flying saucer has a rather respectable pedigree, because Dr. Hynek, the American astronomer, he brought me a few years ago the photostat of a newspaper report from a newspaper in Denison, Texas. I think it was January 15, 1878. And it was the account of an American farmer who'd seen one over his farm. And he said it was hovering. And when he was interviewed by the local paper, he said, well, I guess it looked like a saucer. So the term is nearly 100 years old. Now you say, what do I think they are? I haven't a clue. We are not people who have any theories, any fixed theories about what they are. All that we say is that something very strange is happening, that many people are having these strange experiences. We are trying to keep the record. Perhaps future generations, if there are any, which I think is rather doubtful, but if there are any, perhaps some who come after us may be able to see the pattern running through it all and may know what it all means.
The editor of Flying Saucer Review is Charles Bowen, a full-time civil servant. The magazine has no offices, and he does most of his work recording sightings and editing articles during his frequent railway journeys to meet other ufologists. He's proud of how widely his magazine's read.
We go to about 70 different countries, and believe it or not, great bodies like the Soviet Academy of Sciences, they subscribe to 3 copies. The Chinese Academy of Sciences, they do as well. The United Nations Library, the House of Commons, government libraries everywhere, French space agencies, as well as ordinary people, people in universities, everywhere in the world.
On this occasion, Charles Bowen, as one of the country's leading experts on UFOs, was on his way to Norwich to take part in a regional television programme. In East Anglia, there's been nothing like the rash of sightings over Banbury, but there have been enough mysterious happenings and unexplained sightings to arouse interest, and in some cases, even concern.
Gentlemen, I believe we have our first phone call now, so if you'd like to pick up your phones. Hello, who's there?
My name's Hilton Tepp from Chelmsford. I'd like to ask simply this. Is there any evidence at all on record to suggest that unidentified flying objects are unfriendly towards us?
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that bears somewhat on what we've already been discussing, I suppose. Would you say, Charles Byrne, that they are unfriendly?
Well, I've seen some reports of very unfriendly things which are supposed to have happened when these things have been present. There was one instance of a fort near Rio de Janeiro where some soldiers on guard watched an object of this kind come down. It hovered within about 20 meters of the top of the fort where they were on sentry duty, and an oppressive heat overpowered these men, so much so that they tried to seek shelter beneath guns or all sorts of emplacements and anywhere like this, and they were very badly burned. And what's more, they were burned beneath the surface of clothing, which would seem to suggest some form of perhaps radiation which penetrated their clothing onto their skin.
After the programme, Charles Bowen explained why, according to the ufologists, the Ministry of Defence shows such apparent indifference to what some consider to be a threat in our skies.
Well, I imagine military authorities are put up a front of being indifferent. They don't wish to acknowledge, for example, that there's something in our airspace about which they can do very little. But this, of course, doesn't mean to say that this something is hostile. Its effects might be dangerous on certain individuals, but it is not basically, apparently hostile. But there are very beneficent things that have happened.
But in fact, the military authorities have gone further than just ignoring you. They have said, quite categorically in America, that flying saucers do not exist.
Well, I wouldn't say they've said that. I think you must be alluding to the Condon report. Yes, again,
categorically, they do not exist.
He said that, and yet within his pages, they have some 90 different cases which they've studied, or studied in part, and 30 of these are listed as unidentified. And despite that, Dr. Condon said this is not a subject which is of vital importance to science, that science would not benefit by the further study of unidentified flying objects. And yet there are things like the Lakenheath Bentwaters case.
What was the Lakenheath episode?
It was a rather remarkable thing which started, I believe the date was the 13th of August. It was the night of the 13th, the 14th of August, 1956. Now this was secret until 1969, when the Condon report released details of it. We were able to piece this together. They didn't mention it as being Lakenheath in the actual case history, but elsewhere in the Condon report it was stated the Lakenheath Bentwaters case. We know about it that way. And a number of objects were tracked on radar at Bentwaters, one at 9:30, a series of them between 9:30 and 10.
Bentwaters is the American Air Force
base?
It's
a Royal Air Force base which is known least to the Americans. They have a fighter bomber station there, I believe. And they were tracked on radar, coming across Bentwaters, one of them, at a speed of allegedly 4,000 miles per hour. Then another group, very slow moving, at speeds up to about 180 miles an hour, of 15 different objects, 3 in a triangular formation and then others widely dispersed, moved out to sea, formed up into one object or echo-producing body, and then hovered for 15 minutes. Then there was another one after that, and then at about 11 o'clock, another thing came in at about 2,000 miles per hour, which was seen by ground observers as well as the radar, and also was observed from a plane flying above it. It passed beneath the ground observers and an aircraft. Now this one was tracked as going towards Lakenheath, so Lakenheath were alerted to this. And the radar at Lakenheath picked it up, and thereupon there was a whole series of visitations, let's call them that, at Lakenheath. Things were plotted moving in a rectangular formation with 90-degree turns without any hesitation. Weird things. And in the end, they asked the Royal Air Force to scramble a night fighter, a Venom jet. And this Venom was vectored onto the thing, locked on with its nose radar, and the pilot remarked that he had observed this light in front of him. Well, he lost that one. He was then vectored onto another, and in following this, he suddenly lost him. But this had been seen by ground observers on the radar as having flipped over the back of him, and was then following close onto his tail, and it stayed in this position despite very many evasive manoeuvres that he made to shake it off. It was quite a remarkable thing, and yet this subject is deemed not worthy of further scientific consideration. Yet a thing like that must be on the records of the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force.
I don't know about great detail. It's
The RAF fighter base, Wattisham. The Ministry of Defence Air has just one man, Anthony Davis, to investigate UFO reports, not, as some ufologists claim, an entire department. Anthony Davis receives reports but doesn't request them, and he's often accused of being indifferent and secretive.
Yes, people do say that. And yet I don't think we are cagey, but we are cagey in one sense. We treat a report from an individual as in confidence between the individual and ourselves, and we will not release the details of that report to a third party.
What proportion of the reports that you get would you say lend themselves to rational explanation?
Of the ones we've had in the past 12 or 13 years, we have been able to give what we think is a rational explanation and a simple explanation of rather over 90%. And in that period, 9.3%, I think, are unexplainable, but we always consider that that is because there's been insufficient data to say precisely what they were.
Ufologists, of course, disagree with you and say that the fact that there is nearly 10% which can't be explained away is exactly the sort of figure they need to prove they do really exist. What do you do with people who write to you and say things like that?
We don't really try to get into an argument about our findings. We take the line that the editor's decision is final as far as possible, but of course that does not prevent people from writing back, as they often do, to say they disagree with our findings when we've found that the sighting was almost certainly an aircraft or a meteorological balloon or a piece of space junk or a star. And really, we take the line that you can't persuade a convinced ufologist that what he saw has a simple explanation.
The most dramatic UFO sightings are nearly always made at night. They're usually seen as lights moving across the sky, sometimes apparently stationary, sometimes moving rapidly and disappearing. Maybe this is an example of the kind of inexplicable movement that's so often reported. This light could be interpreted as a strange craft slowly approaching. Anthony Davis wanted us to film this because he feels it could explain many of the sightings reported near military installations.
If military installation was an airfield or was near an airfield, that might well be the source of the UFO sighting. For example, I do know that we've had a large number of sightings. Over 80 have been sent to us alone from the Banbury area. I attribute nearly all of those to the fact that it's the climb-out lane for the F-111s from Upper Hayford, climbing in reheat, that means with their afterburners on, would give an impression, perhaps, of a strange light hovering or climbing vertically upward if you were looking up the tailpipe, as it were, and then perhaps swerving rapidly off to one side or the other as the aircraft turns away from its climbing lane.
What about the fact that so many of the people who claim to have seen UFOs and claim to have seen these lights flashing about the skies also nearly always claim that they're carried out in dead silence?
Well, of course, an aircraft up high is silent. You don't hear it on the ground. And some sightings have undoubtedly been of contrails with an aircraft, an invisible aircraft, at the head of it. Other sightings have been of the jet pipes, which again, as I say, glow red, even in daylight if it's got afterburners on, and then disappear or perhaps turn into a condensation trail as the aircraft gets up high. But you wouldn't hear it if the aircraft was above 30,000 feet or even 25,000 feet.
Chris Evans is a psychologist and author with a special interest in cults, religions, and tricks of perception that can deceive. UFOs may not be just in the mind, but they could often be in the eye of the beholder. Like the Ministry of Defence, he believes that ufologists are frequently mistaken about the source of what they believe to be strange objects in the sky.
Oh, I think the very simple explanations are, for example, people misinterpret ordinary aircraft, or if they're moving at night, they meteorites and things like this. Ordinary meteorological and aeronautical phenomena. There's also the fact that experiments have been conducted in which you take a class of students outside and say, now, do you see something moving up in the sky? And whether there's anything there or not, you'll get a high percentage of the class who actually say they see something. In fact, anyone who pilots an airplane will have frequently seen things in the skies that he might call UFOs. The simplest and most common, I've got a rather fancy name of musky volitantes, which are simply little specks of detached cell that float about in the fluid inside the eye. Occasionally these come into focus, and they're seen in vision as little round objects with dots in the middle, and these drift about in the fluid and then suddenly disappear. Now this is, a lot of people are very puzzled by these. They've got a name, they're called floaters, And if you do see these projected against a bright blue sky, or against any kind of sky for that matter, they do look like a sort of round aerial object. Now, that's a very simple physiological explanation. There's another very common one which people don't often know about. If you look at the sun or an electric light bulb or a light reflected off a metal surface or anything like that, if you look at it without intending to, you can get what's called an after image. Now, an after image is simply the fact that the bright light bleaches the pigment in the retina at the back of the eye. And while the pigment is recovering, it continues to send signals to the brain, and the brain infers that there's something there.
How far do you think that people believe in the existence of flying saucers because they want to believe in the existence of flying saucers?
I think this is really the crucial point. I don't think, when one talks about want, in psychological terms, one has to be careful, because what one doesn't always know what one wants, and yet one nevertheless still wants it. I think, broadly speaking, what's happened here is that, taking it on a sort of global level, orthodox religious beliefs which have helped mankind through the whole problem of the enormous mystery of the universe for thousands of years, the traditional explanations of orthodox religion are ceasing to have the punch that they once had. I mean, they're essentially tales of archangels, devils, and so on and so forth. Once upon a time, these were useful reference points in man's relationship to the unknown. Now, of course, they simply don't ring true anymore. And whereas Orthodox religion has made the mistaken assumption that what people want are vicars riding motorbikes into churches and things like that, in fact, it's a very different kind of updating that people need. Now, in plain fact, the universe is very large, millions of stars, maybe millions of stars with inhabited planetary systems, and it would be very curious indeed if some of these weren't peopled by intelligent beings who very likely have developed space travel, and indeed they could possibly have visited Earth. And I suspect that the cracking decline in Orthodox religious belief over the last 50 years, and particularly the accelerating one in the last 20, has led to people really needing saviors in the skies, in the literal sense of the word. So, but on the other hand, I don't think it's a matter of wanting. I think if you talk to the average ufologist, he would reject this hypothesis with great vigor, because he'd say, I'm a perfectly stable and secure individual, and I don't need any gods of any kind. But I think the gods are different. They have different dress and different means of transportation, but they're still gods made up to date.
Well, are those who believe they've seen UFOs really in fact searching for new gods because of their disbelief with old religions? Here in the town hall at Banbury in Oxfordshire are both ufologists and their supporters, as well as those who doubt. But if I can come first of all to you, Mr. Hayne. On film we saw you and your wife and family talking about the unidentified flying object that you saw. How do you now react to what it was that Chris Evans said at the end of the film, that many people who see these things might well be wishing to see new gods in the sky?
This could be true, certainly, because there were a number of sightings following on reports that there had been sightings. This is a very true thing, I'm quite sure. But I think the weight of evidence and the nature of evidence and the circumstances of the evidence point certainly in a large number of occasions in the opposite direction.
Let me take another vicar at this point, while we're still on the religious issue, and ask Mr. Greenaway, what do you feel about it?
I feel that Chris Evans was onto a very good point. I think often man has tried to project himself out into space, and certainly men need something to believe in. The God that the orthodox God of the three-tiered universe is certainly gone for scientific man. And when we try to bring God down into the midst of men, they find this a little too hard to grasp.
You wouldn't believe in a UFO if you saw something in the sky?
I would have to remain completely agnostic until the critical analysis of our scientific age was applied to this.
Chris Evans.
Well, I think that, first of all, it's quite important to get what we mean by UFO right. And one of the difficulties is that I personally believe in UFOs. That's to say that I believe that there have been unidentified flying objects, and I don't suppose there's anyone in the audience or on the panel who doesn't hold this view. The real question seems to be, what's the interpretation? You say I saw an object and we can't explain it by normal means. We don't know for sure that it's an airplane or something floating about in the eye. It's something we can't explain. But where I quarrel with ufologists is in their jump, which seems to me totally without foundation, into the assumption that these things which they can't explain are visitors from other galaxies.
Can I go now to Charles Gibbs Smith? It would be fair and true to say, Mr. Gibbs Smith, would it not, that at one time you were a deep skeptic about ufologists. Indeed, you described many of the people who are here tonight as nuts in a radio broadcast, and now you've joined them and are, in fact, a ufologist yourself.
I think the word ufologist is a dreadful, silly word which means nothing.
The word nuts is
nuts is also a very good word too. No, quite honestly, listening to Chris Evans and Tony Davis astounds me. It's as if they've only heard and read and spoken to the lunatic fringe. As they were speaking, first of all, I couldn't accept anything that Tony Davis says because he is talking within the restrictions of the Official Secrets Act and he can't say a thing. He's finished as regards I'm a historian, I deal with facts. And he's finished because he simply can't say anything whatever he knows, so he's out. Now, when I hear people describing, and I'm very sympathetic with what Chris Evans says, because this is an explanation of many things, my mind harks back to the multitudinous military reports in America, radar sightings, gun sights, radar gun sights, locking onto targets, Lord knows hundreds of the damn things. You can't laugh these off. These are things in military records, fighter pilots. They are not fools. You don't handle a supersonic jet fighter if you're a chap that starts looking at floaters running around your eyes. Nor do the radar sets that lock onto these wretched things. I mean, I'm trying to find out what they are, like the rest of them. I don't know what they are, but for heaven's sake, let's be serious about it.
Let me briefly ask you one more question, if I may. As a man who went through a conversion to a point of view, what was it that converted you?
Oh, perfectly simple. Reading proper case histories. And thousands, looking at the evidence. You have to look at the evidence, and 95% of people who talk about UFOs simply don't know what they're talking about. They've never read the documents. It's exactly as if you ask a lawyer to expatiate on the history of the divorce law, and you find the bloke's never read anything about it at all. Therefore, he argues in a vacuum. Just that. Evidence.
Anthony Davis, I believe not as hamstrung by the Official Secrets Act.
No, I'm not hamstrung in any way by the Official Secrets Act over this issue.
What is your explanation? Or do you believe that your explanation mightn't be thought by some to be too simplistic?
It's thought by some to be perhaps too simplistic, but if we are satisfied that the report, the sighting, has a simple explanation, and that we do that having approached the thing with open minds, we are not indifferent to UFOs, we do investigate them seriously. We put good scientific brains onto the problem with all their experience. We refer, if necessary, to the meteorological office if we think that it might be related to one of their releases of balloons or something else. We refer to the Royal Observatory. We sometimes refer to Jodrell Bank. And we do investigate all the reports we receive. Some of them, as I've said, about 9.3% over the past 12 years, we cannot find an explanation for, so they remain UFOs. That is true. But we believe, at least I believe, having seen these reports, that there just is not enough data in the report to make a reasonable explanation.
Let me ask, if I may, Roger Stanway, has anything that you've heard helped you perhaps change your mind or introduce doubt into your mind?
Not at all. I'd like to come back to what Mr. Davis has said. I myself have had discussions with your consultants at the Ministry of Defence on several cases, and one detailed case in particular in 1967 in Stoke-on-Trent, where there's a lot of documentation involved. Your consultants studied it at great length and came to the conclusion that they couldn't explain what had taken place. They admitted to being baffled. Now, what I'd like to ask and make a constructive suggestion, as usually ufologists are accused of not being constructive, but this I'd like to think is constructive, is to suggest and ask your superior or the person concerned with policy in the Ministry of Defense if he would release those puzzling 10% to the scientific community so that a proper scientific investigation can take place. I don't think there's any point in holding them in files locked away. Get the witnesses' consent if that's required, but for heaven's sake, can we release them and then have a great wealth of talent in our scientific community to study these very puzzling cases, and they are very well documented, I assure you.
Briefly that issue. Would it be possible to do such a thing?
It is not our current policy for two reasons, one of which I explained in that film shot, that we treat them as confidential between the observer and ourselves. We are prepared to release them to a scientific body of high standing if a good case is made out for their release. Now, you've suggested a case, but I don't know whether you represent a scientific body of high standing, Mr. Stanway. I regret to say.
No, I represent the main national association which investigates the phenomena, and we've been asking this for 12 years.
Yes.
Have you found a scientific body that would endorse your position to the point that it would allow its name to be put forward to the Ministry of Defence? Therefore, Mr. Davis could say, yes, we'll release to them.
Well, understand that the scientists are very cagey about coming out into the open unless the subject has scientific respectability. And I think what would help this was if the Ministry of Defence was to say, well, look, we are puzzled by these 10%. Can we have your assistance?
What about Alf Parker?
Well, I want to believe in UFOs. I want them to become IFOs. I look forward to the time when one lands and is identified. But at the moment, I'm only too well aware of my own physical inability sometimes to identify things properly, especially at night. Only the other evening, coming to Banbury, it seemed to be a fire, but it was a reflection of the neon lights on the clouds, and that sort of effect so often leads us astray. So I'm sceptical, and there are several technical points that worry me.
For instance?
One's, for example, I've heard this evening that they've come perhaps from another star system. Could we have an explanation perhaps of how they would have the energy, the fuel for this? When they're here, how long can they stay? The problems of several years at very high speeds. Are there any explanations of these?
Eleanor Reed, have you a theory?
I believe that there are inhabitants in various other planets which have arrived at a very much higher stage of evolution than we have. And if we, with our limited resources in 100 years, not even that, of airplane and aircraft construction, can get men on the moon, why should not these people in other planets with thousands of years more civilization be able to achieve the very simple task of bringing their craft to this planet, possibly to help us, seeing we're in such an appalling mess at the present time?
If I could ask you to remain on your feet for a moment, because you've raised an issue there. Why, you touched on the idea of why you think visitors from other planets, or even other star systems, may be visiting us. Why are they visiting us, in your opinion?
Because I think they are very afraid that we are about to blow not only ourselves up with our constant atomic testing, but other planets as well, not only in our own solar system, but in other galaxies, because outer space is very thin.
Before we go any further, there's a small boy who either wants to leave the room or is very anxious to speak at the end of the room. What is it you want to say?
Excuse me, if these Martians caused war, what would we able to do?
Well, let's call them visitors and not Martians. Let me put that question to Chris Evans.
What the question was, what would they be able to do?
If they started war on the planet, if UFOs were visitors and they were warlike, what could anybody on this planet do about it?
Oh, honestly, I don't know how one can really ask that, because even how one can answer it, even jokingly, because one really doesn't have any idea what people from Mars would be able to do or what they wouldn't be able to do. I imagine, if just to take it in the spirit in which it's asked, that if people were capable of sending spaceships reliably from Mars, they'd have some pretty good weapons technology to back it up, but that's just a guess.
Let me ask, Keith Palmer, we have some photographs here that a member of your association provided through you of what is supposed to be a saucer-shaped UFO. The photographer is not here, but you are. There's another one. I'll pass them around in a minute. There is an enlargement of the first one, and there is an enlargement of the second one. Now, if I could ask, why was the photographer who took those unwilling to be here tonight?
Well, I spoke to him a couple of days ago, and he seems to be pretty frightened by the whole affair. He's frightened through what he's seen and through what he's photographed as well.
You mean his space people are after?
Well, somebody's quietened him down. There's no doubt about that.
Well, what is it specifically that he says he's frightened of?
He just doesn't want the publicity at the moment.
But he's allowed your organisation to use these photographs for publicity
He just said, I
purposes.
saw something, I photographed it. What it was, I don't know.
Do you believe in these photographs?
I'm 50%.
You see, the uncharitable
50-50.
might think that you wouldn't want to come forward because the authenticity of the photographs might be challenged.
It seems that way. No.
What would you say?
As I say, I'm 50-50. I don't know what to say at the moment.
Chap with his hand up in about the fourth row. Could I hear from you, sir?
I don't think you really have the right to condemn a man when he's not here to defend himself.
Well, he was invited to be here, and he did at first accept, as Mr. Palmer knows, because he's part of Mr. Palmer's organisation. And then he didn't come, but we were told we could still use the photographs. Now, it seems to me that if the photographs are to be used, one must discuss them.
Certainly, but I still don't think you have a right to contradict a man.
Well, Mr. Palmer agreed to come and speak for him, you see, among other things.
I'm curious about what he is actually frightened about. I mean, there seems to be a certain element in a lot of the things that we've heard which suggests that there's a cover-up of some kind going on. I mean, I read that or I may have misunderstood Mr. Gibbs Smith, but I thought I detected in the way that he questioned Mr. Davis that, in fact, the Ministry of Defence were holding something back, and that there was some great plot to prevent people knowing the truth about what these unidentified flying objects were. Now, are you suggesting at all that your colleague is suffering from the same kind of feeling about it?
Do you believe in the photographs?
I just don't know what to say at the moment. I just can't say, you know.
What would you think them to be?
I've no idea. UFO.
Can I ask Charles Gibbs Smith, has anything that you've heard from those that are sceptical produced in you a condition where you might change your mind?
No, but I've changed it already. I had stupid opinions, which I was stupid enough to voice before I knew anything about it. The more I read the evidence, especially the evidence of highly qualified technical people who've seen them, including men of the caliber of Professor Tombaugh, who discovered the planet Pluto, who's left a very fine description of his own sightings. I was American trained myself, and I've read all the evidence that comes in that I can find from Dr. Hynek, who's a friend of mine, and the evidence has simply overwhelmed the doubts. That is to say that there is something very, very odd that happens quite independently of human beings, and something that can be registered on radar, and something I want to know about and am trying to find out about.
Chris Evans, anything that you've heard tonight make you feel that perhaps your position was too sceptical?
No, in fact, my position's hardened in a way, I'm happy to say. I feel that a lot of the comments that have been made, in fact, have, not to labour a point, backed up rather what I've been saying about the growing religious interest, or the growing religious feeling that this particular range of phenomena have got. And there's a very interesting situation. The great psychologist Jung was once interviewed about whether he believed in flying saucers or not, and he said casually in the course of the interview that he thought there may be such things, which is a reasonable comment to make. And the next day the newspapers were full of remarks that Jung believed in flying saucers, and he was a bit taken aback by this, so he immediately issued a press denial. And he found to his surprise that the press didn't print the denial. So he immediately asked himself the question, why is it that news that people believe in saucers or UFOs is welcome, and news that they don't believe in it is not? And that's a question which I continually ask myself even now.
speculation, two-way communication with extraterrestrials. Now, those blokes are not paid millions of dollars to throw out that kind of suggestion for fun. I just throw it out.
Eleanor Reed, have you a theory? I wonder if I could ask you to stand up.
I believe that there are inhabitants in various other planets which have arrived at a very much higher stage of evolution than we have. And if we, with our limited resources in 100 years, not even that, of airplane and aircraft construction, can get men on the moon, why should not these people in other planets with thousands of years more civilization be able to achieve the very simple task of bringing their craft to this planet, possibly to help us, seeing we're in such an appalling mess at the present time?
If I could ask you to remain on your feet for a moment, because you've raised an issue there. Why, you touched on the idea of why you think visitors from other planets, or even other star systems, may be visiting us. Why are they visiting us, in your opinion?
Because I think they are very afraid that we are about to blow not only ourselves up with our constant atomic testing, but other planets as well, not only in our own solar system, but in other galaxies. Because outer space is very thin.
Would it not make sense, perhaps, if that was their concern, that they communicated it rather than just visited, somebody might ask? Why have they not got in touch with us?
Well, perhaps they have got in touch with certain people, but they're not believed. Arthur Shuttleworth is a case in point. He's written 3 books and is now about to write a 4th one on the subject. He actually claims to have held converse with people from other planets.
I'd like to advance an anthropological argument. I think in principle the point that you're making, that why shouldn't superintelligent beings have developed space travel, which seems to be very much the one Mr. Gibbs Smith is making, is perfectly acceptable. The question still seems to be, what is the evidence that they visited here? Now, I'd like to suggest that if, in fact, there are such civilizations and they have successfully engaged in space travel, that they're going to be very, very cautious indeed before they make themselves known. Our own experience on this planet is that when we have invaded the territory of simple beings, of simple civilizations, we've intervened in a way which has made it very unpleasant. In fact, we've cut right into the basis of their society. And I should think it would be exceedingly likely that the same argument would be applied by them. In other words, if we were being visited, that they would be very, very careful that they didn't let us know about it.
I want to, before I take the next speaker, it's all right, it's all happened again. I apologize for the loss of light for a moment there, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. O'Brien.
I just want to say that a ufologist, a true ufologist, is not a man who believes in somebody coming down from another planet or traveling through space. A true ufologist is a man who recognizes that there is a phenomenon occurring outside the Earth in his airspace which he doesn't understand. And therefore he goes out scientifically to try and find what is happening. But unfortunately, we are all blinkered within our own disciplines. The psychologist looks through a narrow tunnel. He doesn't go out and talk on the astronomical side or the meteorological side. The man from the Minister of Defense has a series of people who do investigations, and I very seriously challenge whether they have the proper disciplines to do it. I think Mr. Crichton is blinkered too, because he thinks there are intelligences on Earth who are running things. We have no right to make any decision whatsoever until this evidence has been thoroughly and scientifically sifted. And it can only be done by getting the astronomer and the psychologist and the meteorologist and the anthropologist together and sitting them down to work through the thousands of cases which we have and which are fully documented, and to come to a rational, discussed, and final agreement.
Let me ask Keith Palmer, talking of evidence. Keith Palmer, we have some photographs here that a member of your association provided through you of what is supposed to be a saucer-shaped UFO. The photographer is not here, but you are. There's another one. I'll pass them around in a minute. There is an enlargement of the first one, and there is an enlargement of the second one. Now, if I could ask, why was the photographer who took those unwilling to be here tonight?
Well, I spoke to him a couple of days ago, and he seems to be pretty frightened by the whole affair. He's frightened through what he's seen and through what he's photographed as well.
You mean space people are after?
Well, somebody's quieting him down. There's no doubt about that.
Well, what is it specifically that he says he's frightened of?
He just doesn't want the publicity at the moment.
But he's allowed your organisation to use these photographs for publicity
He just said, I
purposes.
saw something, I photographed it. What it was, I don't know.
Do you believe in these photographs?
I'm 50%.
You see, the uncharitable
50-50.
might think that you wouldn't want to come forward because the authenticity of the photographs might be challenged.
It seems that way. No.
What would you say?
As I say, I'm 50-50. I don't know what to say at the moment.
Chap with his hand up in about the fourth row. Could I hear from you, sir?
I don't think you really have the right to condemn a man when he's not here to defend himself.
Well, he was invited to be here, and he did at first accept, as Mr. Palmer knows, because he's part of Mr. Palmer's organisation. And then he didn't come, but we were told we could still use the photographs. Now, it seems to me that if the photographs are to be used, one must discuss them.
Certainly, but I still don't think you have a right to contradict a man.
Well, Mr. Palmer agreed to come and speak for him, you see, among other things.
I'm curious about what he is actually frightened about. I mean, there seems to be a certain element in a lot of the things that we've heard which suggests that there's a cover-up of some kind going on. I mean, I read that or I may have misunderstood Mr. Gibbs Smith, but I thought I detected in the way that he questioned Mr. Davis that, in fact, the Ministry of Defence were holding something back, and that there was some great plot to prevent people knowing the truth about what these unidentified flying objects were. Now, are you suggesting at all that your colleague is suffering from the same kind of feeling about it?
Do you believe in the photographs?
I just don't know what to say at the moment. I just can't say, you know.
What would you think them to be?
I've no idea. UFO?
Chap in the third row with his hand up. You, sir.
Well, I've come to the conclusion what I've seen myself, and I've actually taken photographs and I've got them here tonight in colour. But what I really want to say is that why is it that so many people see the same thing over and over again through? It's all right, people saying, "Oh, it's just a piece of space debris." They've imagined it, but you look at the facts. There's so many people throughout the country have seen very, very similar, the same thing or UFO, and there's a lot of people have seen.
Right. You say you have seen and photographed a UFO. What do you believe it to be?
Well, I don't know. I've got the photographs here tonight, and this is what I was hoping to find out. I mean, I personally don't know, but as the film as we've seen earlier, there was a child, I believe, on the programme saying it changed to pink with a dark red shape. Well, this is exactly what I've seen, and it was so